European SS volunteers, drawn from across the continent and bound by a fanatical oath to Hitler, found themselves abandoned, hunted, and betrayed. They had marched under the Black Sun, believing in a cause that promised glory and brotherhood, but as Berlin fell and the Western Allies shook hands with the Soviets, that cause dissolved into ashes. In this video, we delve into the brutal and often tragic fates of these foreign SS fighters, men from France, Belgium, the Netherlands and beyond, who were left with nowhere to run and no one to save them. Some were executed without trial, others were tortured, and many vanished into the gulags of the East. This is not a tale of honor or redemption, but of the unforgiving end faced by the European SS. In the early, mist-laden hours of April 24th, 1945, as the German capital teetered on the edge of total collapse, SS Brigade Führer Gustav Krukenberg received urgent orders from Army Group Vistula. The directive was clear. He was to lead what remained of the 57th Battalion of the 33rd Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS Charlemagne into the heart of Berlin. This was not a retreat, nor a strategic redeployment. It was a death march into the inferno. The remnants of the division, comprised almost entirely of French volunteers, had been regrouping at the SS training camp in Neustrelitz when the call came. Krukenberg, a seasoned veteran now entrusted with one of the most desperate last stands of the war, was ordered to report directly to the Reich Chancellery for further instructions upon arrival in the besieged city. Wasting no time, Krukenberg woke Hauptsturmführer Henry Fenet, the battle-hardened commander of Sturmbataillon Charlemagne, as the 57th Battalion was ominously known. Emerging from his quarters, Fenet found Krukenberg already dressed in a long grey leather greatcoat, the expression on his face betraying the weight of the moment. He had come to ask for volunteers, men willing to fight to the bitter end against the Red Army in the ruins of Berlin. For the soldiers of the Charlemagne division, foreign volunteers who had sworn allegiance to Hitler's vision, this was the final reckoning. Many saw it as an honour, a chance to cement their legacy in a fight that was already lost. Others knew it was a suicide mission but chose to stand regardless. Yet despite nearly all of them wanting to go, only 90 were chosen. There was no room for more. Only a handful of vehicles were available to transport them. At precisely 8:30 a.m, the column departed. 2 half-tracks and 3 heavy trucks formed their convoy, their engines roaring to life one last time. The journey into Berlin was fraught with peril. Soviet air superiority dominated the skies, forcing Krukenberg to lead his men along concealed back roads, weaving through pine forests where the tree cover might shield them from Soviet fighter bombers circling like vultures above. But the road to Berlin had become a gauntlet of destruction. Soviet forces had already sealed off the northern approaches, forcing the convoy to take a dangerous, circuitous route. As they entered the city from the west, they passed ragged columns of retreating German troops, men who had abandoned hope of any salvation. Some of these fleeing soldiers cast bewildered glances at the Charlemagne volunteers, shouting that they were headed the wrong way. Others simply tapped the sides of their heads, signalling their belief that these foreign SS men were utterly insane, marching not to survival but to certain death. Berlin, once the beating heart of the Reich, was now an apocalyptic wasteland. Barricades blocked major thoroughfares, entire districts had been reduced to smoking rubble. The echoes of distant artillery and the ominous rumble of Soviet armor could be heard closing in from every direction. As the convoy carefully navigated through the corpse of the city, the weight of impending doom pressed down upon them. By nightfall, after hours of grueling maneuvering through ruined streets, Krukenberg's men reached the Olympia Stadion, a massive complex on the eastern bank of the Havel River in the western section of the city. There, in the shadow of the towering stadium, once a symbol of Nazi grandeur during the 1936 Olympics, the weary volunteers prepared for what was to come. This was their final night of relative safety. Beyond this moment, beyond these few hours of rest, lay only chaos, fire and death. As the exhausted Charlemagne volunteers scavenged through a ransacked Luftwaffe supply depot, searching desperately for anything edible or drinkable to sustain them for the coming battle, their commander, SS Brigadeführer Gustav Krukenberg, made his way through the battered ruins of Berlin to the Reich Chancellery. Berlin's grand halls were reduced to command bunkers where officers pored over maps that no longer held any hope of salvation. In this nerve centre of a dying regime, Krukenberg met with General of Artillery Helmuth Weidling, the newly appointed commander of Berlin's defence. A pragmatic soldier, Weidling knew the city's fate was sealed, but he was determined to organise a last stand that would at least slow the inevitable Soviet conquest. Weidling wasted no time in giving Krukenberg his new orders. The SS commander was to take charge of Defence Sector C, an area covering southeast Berlin. It was one of the most critical sectors of the city, directly in the path of the Red Army's relentless advance. Here, the Soviets were flooding in from the southeastern suburbs, smashing through the last remnants of German resistance block by block. If the sector fell too quickly, the Soviets would have a straight path to the Reichstag and Hitler's bunker. To hold this crumbling front, Krukenberg would command a hodgepodge force. His own battle-hardened French volunteers of Sturmbataillon Charlemagne were among the most determined and ideologically committed, but their numbers were pitifully small. Reinforcing them were the last shattered remnants of the 11th SS Panzergrenadier Division Nordland, an elite unit once feared for its combat prowess, but now reduced to a mere shadow of its former strength. Beyond these, Krukenberg had to rely on whatever scattered defenders Weidling's staff could muster. Stragglers, wounded men patched up just enough to hold a rifle, Hitler youth barely old enough to shave, and Volkssturm conscripts drafted from Berlin's civilian population. Some of these men had never fired a weapon in combat before. Others had already fought for weeks without proper rest, running on nothing but desperation and the knowledge that surrender meant either execution or an agonizing death in a Soviet labor camp. Krukenberg accepted the grim reality of his new command. He knew he was not leading an army into battle, he was leading a funeral procession into the abyss. The last stand of the European SS volunteers had begun. For the Waffen SS soldiers of the Charlemagne and Nordland divisions, the decision to fight to the death in the ruins of Berlin was not driven solely by allegiance to Hitler. Instead, it was rooted in their deep-seated hatred of Bolshevism, a belief that had drawn many foreign volunteers into the Waffen SS ranks in the first place. To them, the advancing Soviet forces represented not just military defeat, but the destruction of everything they stood for: national identity, European sovereignty, and the order they had fought to preserve. With Soviet tanks and infantry tightening their grip on Berlin, these men knew that surrender was not an option. The stories of Soviet reprisals, executions, mass rapes, and the brutal treatment of prisoners were already well known. For the foreign SS volunteers, many of whom had burned their bridges to their homelands, there was no future beyond this battle. Their stand in the bombed-out streets of the German capital was an act of defiance in the face of certain annihilation. Victory was no longer within reach, yet they fought on. The existence of these foreign Waffen SS units was an extension of the original German Schutzstaffel, the elite paramilitary force that had evolved from Hitler's personal bodyguard into one of the most feared and controversial fighting forces of the war. The Waffen SS itself has since attained near-mythic status in the annals of military history, known for its fanatical discipline, battlefield prowess, and willingness to fight to the last man. It had begun as little more than a security force, tasked with protecting Nazi party functions and ensuring the safety of its highest-ranking officials. But as the war escalated, the Waffen SS transformed into an elite military wing that rivaled the Wehrmacht, growing into an international fighting force that drew in thousands of foreign volunteers from across Europe. These men, many from France, Scandinavia, the Netherlands, and even the Balkans, saw themselves as warriors of a new order, a pan-European army defending the continent against the encroaching Soviet tide. Yet by April 1945, that vision had collapsed. Berlin, once the centre of Hitler's empire, had become a death trap, and the foreign SS troops trapped inside were about to experience the full weight of Soviet vengeance. They had chosen their side, and there would be no escape. It is a widely held misconception that all Waffen SS men were willing volunteers, driven by ideological conviction or loyalty to the regime. In reality, many were deceived, coerced, or outright conscripted into service. Waffen SS recruiters, often operating under the pressures of wartime manpower shortages, resorted to misleading tactics to fill their ranks, particularly when enlisting foreign volunteers. One such case involved Danish recruits who were falsely promised that they would be sent to Germany to participate in political and athletic training. Expecting nothing more than ideological education and physical conditioning, they instead found themselves forcibly inducted into the Waffen SS, handed weapons, and deployed to the front. Similarly, in occupied France, 500 Flemish factory workers employed by the Germans in northern industrial centres were lured into service under the guise of lucrative job opportunities in Poland. These men, believing they were signing contracts for higher wages and better working conditions, soon discovered that they had been whisked away not to factories but to SS training camps, where refusal to serve was not an option. Beyond deception, the Waffen SS also had few reservations about accepting recruits of questionable backgrounds. SS leadership, particularly SS Obergruppenführer Gottlob Berger, one of the primary architects of the foreign SS recruitment program, believed that criminals and outcasts could be molded into ruthless warriors. Under his directive, Waffen SS recruiters were explicitly told to overlook the criminal pasts of volunteers, including those awaiting trial or under investigation in their home countries. Berger's philosophy was simple. He saw criminal elements as prime candidates for elite soldiers, arguing that with the right discipline and conditioning, they would fight harder than ordinary men. To him, the fact that many joined not out of ideology, but out of desperation or a desire to escape justice, was irrelevant. As he once remarked, such recruiting problems were nothing new. Armies throughout history had always found ways to turn society's undesirables into hardened fighters. Yet while the Waffen SS may have marketed itself as an elite, ideologically pure fighting force, the reality was often far different. Many of its foreign volunteers were tricked or trapped into service, and as Berlin burned in April 1945, thousands of these men, whether true believers or unwilling conscripts, found themselves caught in a battle they had no chance of winning. When the exhausted soldiers of the Nordland Division were sent to the Balkans to refit and recover from the brutal fighting on the Eastern Front, they found no respite. Instead of rest, they were thrust into a relentless and savage war against Tito's partisans, who waged a ruthless guerrilla campaign against the German occupiers. Ambushes, sabotage, and night raids became a daily reality, and in return, the German response was equally unforgiving. Brutality was no longer an aberration, it was routine. The war in the Balkans had become a struggle of annihilation, with no quarter asked and none given. By 1945, the last vestiges of order in the German ranks were crumbling. Whether they wore the field grey of the Wehrmacht or the blackened tunics of the Waffen SS, most German troops were no longer fighting for victory, they were fighting for survival. Each day brought only more retreat, more casualties, and more bitter defeats. In mid-March 1945, as the Soviet juggernaut continued its unrelenting westward advance, the Germans hastily cobbled together a battle group from various shattered SS units in a desperate attempt to hold the Hungarian village of Sored. Among them was an officer of the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf's Sturmgeschütz Battalion, Hans Geissendorf, who would later recount the horror of that doomed engagement. As the Soviet attack unfolded, the German defences quickly began to buckle. The Waffen SS troops, though experienced and battle-hardened, were running dangerously low on ammunition. Rifles and machine guns fell silent, their magazines empty. Soldiers dug through their pouches for any last remaining cartridges, but there were none left. Some scavenged from the dead, while others realized with growing horror that they had nothing left to fight with but their bare hands. As the Soviets closed in, German soldiers resorted to sheer desperation. Out of bullets they wielded trench knives, rifle butts, and even entrenching tools, hacking, stabbing, and bludgeoning in a final feral attempt to hold their ground. It was a scene of pure carnage, hand-to-hand combat in its most primal form. Then, from the Soviet lines, figures began emerging from foxholes just 50 yards away. For a brief moment, there was a pause. The Red Army soldiers, seeing the futility of further bloodshed, offered the Germans a chance to surrender. The offer hung in the air, a fleeting opportunity for survival, but the Waffen SS troops refused. Whether out of fanatical loyalty, a refusal to become prisoners of war, or the grim realization that surrender would likely lead to execution, they stood their ground. The Soviets wasted no more time. The attack resumed with overwhelming force. Waves of Red Army infantry surged forward, their battle cries echoing across the battlefield. Behind them, the earth shook as Soviet heavy tanks rolled into position, their massive guns spewing fire and steel. The defenders had no answer, no anti-tank weapons, no reinforcements, and no chance. Among those attempting to resist was a reconstituted battalion of the Nordland Division, hastily attached to the Wiking Division, but the battle had already been decided. Within hours, the German positions were overrun, the last remnants of their shattered units wiped out in the onslaught. This was the fate that awaited the men of Nordland, Totenkopf, and all the remaining foreign SS volunteers still fighting in Hitler's collapsing empire. Their war was no longer about conquest or ideology, it was about fighting to the last breath in a war that had long since been lost. The Danes of Panzergrenadier Regiment 24 Denmark fought heroically, recalled Hans Geissendorf years later. I was positioned with our Sturmgeschütz on the outskirts of town, alongside an infantry squad. The entire area was an inferno of destruction, smoke, fire, and the deafening roar of artillery. Then, through the chaos, a messenger arrived, shouting that it was over. We were ordered to break out and attempt to escape westward. The desperate retreat was not born out of panic but necessity. Other assault guns had already become hopelessly mired in the waterlogged fields west of the town, their treads churning up mud until they were immobilized, sitting ducks for Soviet artillery. Before long, Geisendorf and his squad found themselves in the same predicament. Their assault gun, once a formidable instrument of war, was now a useless heap of steel stuck in the soggy terrain. There was only one option left: destruction. "I blew up our Sturmgeschütz with a Panzerfaust," Geisendorf later recounted, the memory still vivid. "Then we ran for our lives. Artillery shells rained down around us, detonating just ahead of us, throwing up clouds of dirt and shrapnel. There was no time to think, only to run. Not everyone could make it. The pace was grueling, and exhaustion, wounds, or sheer hopelessness overcame many." Geisendorf saw officers from both SS Panzergrenadier Regiment 24 Denmark and his own division take out their pistols and end their lives rather than be captured. It was a fate many Waffen SS soldiers feared more than death itself. Meanwhile, nearby, the Soviet encirclement was closing in on German positions at Stuhlweissenberg. The morale of the Wiking Division, one of the most elite foreign Waffen SS divisions, began to fracture. It was clear to Oberfuhrer Karl Ulrich, the division's commander, that if they stayed, they would be annihilated. The Red Army was pressing from all sides and supply lines had been severed. There was only one chance for survival: a breakout. On March 22nd, Ulrich defied Hitler's long-standing orders to hold every inch of ground at all costs and gave the command to withdraw. The Wiking Division, battered and bloodied, would attempt to fight its way westward. It was a decision made out of brutal pragmatism. Disobeying Hitler's orders was treason, but staying would mean certain destruction. Yet, breaking out was easier said than done. The Soviets were relentless, tightening the noose with each passing hour. It fell to another Waffen-SS formation, the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen, to hold open an escape corridor and keep the Soviet forces at bay while Viking made its desperate retreat. The Hohenstaufen troops fought with the tenacity of men who understood the stakes. If the corridor collapsed, thousands of their comrades would be lost. When news of the retreat reached Hitler, he flew into a blind fury. The Führer, still detached from reality, considered any retreat an unforgivable betrayal. His rage turned to punishment. 5 days later, he issued orders that the men of the Hohenstaufen division were to be stripped of their distinctive armbands, symbols that marked them as part of the Waffen-SS elite. To Hitler, they had disgraced themselves. But to those who had fought in the bloody streets and frozen fields of Eastern Europe, it was not shame but survival that mattered now. The death knell of Nazi Germany tolled in the shattered ruins of Berlin. By April 1945, the Third Reich had been reduced to a shrinking patch of land, its capital now encircled by the relentless advance of the Red Army from the east and the Western Allies pressing in from the west. The once mighty German war machine was a skeletal shadow of its former self, and every remaining unit was starved of manpower, ammunition, and fuel. Yet, against all logic, Hitler ordered Waffen-SS formations to converge on Berlin, reinforcing what would become the final battleground of the war. By this point, few German divisions still retained their full strength. Most had been reduced to mere battalions, their numbers dwindled by years of attritional warfare. Their ranks had been filled with stragglers, the wounded, and even teenage conscripts pressed into service in a last-ditch effort to stave off the inevitable. And yet, despite the hopelessness of their situation, the SS fought on. What drove them? For many it was not ideology alone, but the unbreakable bonds forged in years of brutal combat. These men had endured the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, the merciless battles in the Balkans, and the desperate defences of the Reich's last strongholds. Whether they were native Germans or foreign volunteers, many had long since lost any hope of returning home. Their countries, occupied by the Allies or the Soviets, would never welcome them back. To be captured by the Red Army was to face almost certain execution, or an even crueler fate in the gulags of Siberia. Even as the walls closed in, surrender was unthinkable. Even in the last hopeless days, there was no question of laying down our weapons, recalled one Waffen-SS soldier. The choice, as they saw it, was to fight or to die. Despite the obvious reality of impending defeat, some still clung to the belief that a miracle was just around the corner. Throughout the war, the German propaganda machine had boasted of Wunderwaffen, so-called wonder weapons, that would turn the tide and snatch victory from the jaws of disaster. Many Waffen SS men believed that these game-changing weapons were about to be unleashed. "We knew important things were going on," recalled Erik Wallin, a Swedish volunteer in the Nordland division, that sensational weapons would soon be put into action, and thanks to that the war would take on a completely new character. "We knew that even better things were coming." But Berlin had no miracles left. The promised wonder weapons never arrived. The war by now was measured in days, and for the Waffen SS units fighting in the streets of the German capital, the only certainty left was death. As the Red Army fought its way into Berlin, its commanders found a fitting way to mark Adolf Hitler's final birthday, April 20th, 1945. The Soviet gift to the Führer came not in the form of speeches or ceremonies, but a relentless bombardment. From positions east of the city, long-range Soviet artillery unleashed a storm of shells upon the German capital, pounding its already ruined streets, demolishing buildings, and turning entire districts into flames and rubble. The war had now reached the very doorstep of the Reich Chancellery. Inside his underground bunker, Hitler, a man once obsessed with shaping the destiny of Europe, was now reduced to issuing delusional commands to armies that no longer existed. 2 days later, on April 22nd, he erupted into one of his final documented fits of rage when he learned that SS Obergruppenführer Felix Steiner's 11th SS Panzer Army had failed to carry out an attack order. Steiner's army had been hastily assembled in the war's final weeks by Heinrich Himmler, a desperate creation of scattered units, ragtag remnants of divisions that had already been shattered. Hitler, still clinging to illusions of counter-offensives, believed Steiner's force could somehow strike at the Soviet flank and turn the tide. But by then, it was an impossibility. There were no reserves, no fuel, no ammunition, only exhausted men facing certain annihilation. When the attack failed to materialize, Hitler snapped. Many historians believe this particular outburst was different. It was not merely frustration or anger, but the realization that the one force he had always believed would never fail him, the Waffen SS, had finally reached its breaking point. But within Berlin itself, some Waffen SS formations still stood defiant. The remnants of the Nordland and Charlemagne divisions had nowhere to retreat, no home to return to. They had sworn to fight to the very end, and for them there was no alternative. The brutal street fighting in Berlin was the direct result of the Soviet victory at Seelow Heights, the last major battle fought between German and Soviet forces before the Red Army entered the city. From April 16th to April 19th, Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front had launched a massive assault against Army Group Vistula, commanded by General Oberst Gotthard Heinrici. The Seelow Heights had been Hitler's last major defensive position on the Oder River, a natural barrier that the Germans hoped would slow the Soviet advance. But despite putting up fierce resistance, Heinrici's forces were eventually overwhelmed by sheer Soviet numbers and firepower. With Seelow Heights lost, Berlin's fate was sealed. The road to the capital lay wide open, and the Red Army poured through. Now there would be no more grand battles, no more coordinated German defences, only chaos, slaughter, and a last stand in the ruins of Hitler's city. The Soviets, who outnumbered the Germans nearly 10-1, tore through General Oberst Gotthard Heinrici's layered defences. The meticulous defensive lines the Germans had built east of Berlin, minefields, anti-tank ditches, and well-placed artillery positions, had delayed the Red Army but ultimately could not stop it. As the last German strongpoints crumbled, Soviet troops flooded into the city, turning Berlin into a battlefield of fire and rubble. Yet Stalin was not satisfied with just one army claiming the prize. In a final show of political maneuvering, he ordered Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front, positioned southeast of Berlin, to advance into the city as well. This decision ignited an intense rivalry between Konev and Marshal Georgy Zhukov, as each sought to be the one credited with delivering the final blow to Hitler's Reich. Their forces pushed deeper into Berlin from multiple directions, eager to reach the Reichstag first and claim the symbolic victory for themselves. The Soviet onslaught was relentless. With overwhelming superiority in numbers and firepower, the Red Army battered the remaining German defenders with a merciless combination of massed artillery, armoured spearheads, and wave after wave of infantry assaults. Berlin's streets became rivers of rubble, its buildings collapsing under the weight of constant bombardment. Most of the Volkssturm, the hastily assembled civilian militia, scattered at the first sign of combat. Armed with little more than outdated rifles and panzerfausts, many of these elderly men and young boys stood no chance against the advancing Soviet war machine. But the Hitler youth, indoctrinated since childhood to fight to the bitter end, stood their ground in the final days of April. With fanatical resolve, they launched suicidal attacks against Soviet tanks, darting between the ruins to fire off last-ditch Panzerfaust shots before being gunned down. Their fierce resistance earned the admiration of the battle-hardened foreign Waffen SS troops, who, by now, had seen it all, but nothing could prepare even the most seasoned SS veterans for the sheer intensity of the Soviet artillery bombardment. Among them was SS Nordland soldier Erich Wallin. He and his comrades took up position inside an abandoned house, attempting to use its walls as cover. But there was no true shelter in Berlin anymore. The Red Army's heavy guns pounded the city without pause, reducing entire streets to craters and debris. The artillery sang and thundered all around, and the blast waves threw us, half-conscious, to and fro between the walls, Wallin later wrote. The bombardment wasn't just deadly, it was disorienting, shaking the earth with each detonation, filling the air with choking limestone dust and the acrid stench of gunpowder. More men died beneath the ruins of collapsing buildings than from direct hits. Ceilings caved in, steel girders twisted and snapped, and brick walls disintegrated into clouds of pulverized stone. The destruction was so intense that the very air became unbreathable, choked with flying debris, burning wood, and fragments of human remains. Realizing that staying meant certain death, Wallin and his fellow SS soldiers abandoned their ruined position, slipping away through back streets and narrow alleyways. Each time they thought they had found safety, more shells came crashing down. Encirclement loomed with every passing hour, and despite their attempts to evade the Soviet advance, their losses continued to mount. The once feared Nordland Division, which had once fought across the Eastern Front with pride, was now reduced to a handful of men desperately fighting for their lives in the final days of the Reich. By April 25th, the situation in Berlin had become apocalyptic. The city's streets were choked with rubble, its buildings reduced to skeletons of shattered stone, and its defenders, dwindling with every hour, were now little more than scattered remnants of once powerful divisions. It was on this day that Hauptsturmführer Henri Ferney's French SS troops joined forces with the last surviving elements of the SS Nordland Division, specifically the remnants of the Denmark and Norge regiments, along with what remained of the division's pioneer battalion. The Nordland troops, now under the command of Sturmbannführer Rudolf Ternede, still possessed a handful of armoured vehicles, assault guns and tanks that had somehow survived the retreat from the Battle of Seelow Heights. Unlike many German units that had abandoned their positions and fled westward in a desperate attempt to surrender to the Americans in Charlottenburg, these SS troops had remained behind, determined to make their last stand in the capital. Their numbers were further reinforced by a ragtag collection of Waffen SS personnel from various nations, Finns, Latvians, Spaniards and Hungarians. Alongside them fought pockets of fanatical Hitler youth, teenage boys who still clung to the dream of victory, and Volkssturm militia, many of them old men armed with little more than bolt-action rifles and makeshift weapons. Despite the chaos surrounding them, this assembled force prepared for one final battle. They gathered near Tempelhof Airport, on the southern edge of the city, where they attempted a counterattack against the advancing Soviets. Initially, they managed to push forward, advancing just over half a mile before they ran headlong into the full weight of the Red Army's southern assault. Leading the Soviet advance was Colonel General Vasily Chuikov's battle-hardened 8th Guards Army, the same force that had bled the Germans white at Stalingrad. These were no inexperienced conscripts. Chuikov's men were veterans of brutal urban warfare. Backing them up was Colonel General Mikhail Katukov's 1st Guards Tank Army, a heavily mechanized force equipped with some of the deadliest armored vehicles the Soviets had to offer. By noon, the battlefield had turned into a maelstrom of death. Fenet's command post, hastily set up in the ruins, came under relentless machine gun fire. Soviet infantry stormed forward, moving in waves behind the cover of their T-34s, their advance marked by the constant thundering of artillery. Realizing they could not sit idle and simply be overwhelmed, the foreign Waffen SS troops launched their own desperate counterattack. With sudden ferocity, they surged forward, forcing the Soviets back in brutal, close-quarters combat. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as though they had gained the upper hand. But their success was short-lived. Soviet reinforcements soon arrived, flanking them from both sides as fresh infantry poured into the fight, aiming to encircle and annihilate them. As night fell, the exhausted foreign SS soldiers retreated, regrouping to form a new defensive position. The Nordland panzer troops, still clinging to their last few functioning armoured vehicles, manoeuvred their assault guns into position behind makeshift barricades of paving stones, using the urban landscape as cover. When the next wave of Soviet tanks rolled forward, the German gunners opened fire, knocking out several enemy vehicles in rapid succession. But their triumph was fleeting. Their ammunition stocks were running dry, and before long the Nordland panzers had no choice but to withdraw, leaving the infantry to fend for themselves. Without armoured support, Fenet's men had no hope of holding their ground. As Soviet troops closed in from all sides, the last French SS fighters fell back once more. Their destination was Anhalter Bahnhof, one of Berlin's grand railway stations, now little more than a bombed-out shell. Nearby, they took shelter in a beer hall, its interior filled with dust, shattered glass, and the ghosts of a world that was vanishing before their eyes. There, in the dim light of flickering lanterns, the French SS men, weary and battered, bedded down for the night. The city around them was collapsing, and they knew that dawn would bring yet another day of slaughter. For the defenders of Berlin there was no escape, only the inevitable and the certainty that the end was near. The fighting resumed with undiminished ferocity the following day. The foreign SS troops, their numbers dwindling, were locked in a desperate battle against Colonel General Vasily Chuikov's relentless spearhead. The streets of Berlin had become an inferno of violence, a labyrinth of ruins where every alleyway and every building became a contested battleground. Our men advanced as if on manoeuvres, recalled one SS Charlemagne soldier describing the battle. They leapt from door to door, storming through shattered entryways and falling upon the red snipers hidden in the upper floors. The Soviet marksmen had turned Berlin's ruined buildings into deadly vantage points, picking off the defenders one by one, but the SS troops adapted quickly, clearing the structures in brutal room-to-room combat. Behind them, the last surviving Nordland tanks and assault guns roared into action, their cannons spitting fire and steel. These armoured behemoths provided crucial cover, blasting apart enemy strongpoints and forcing Soviet infantry to keep their heads down. The attack gained ground, momentarily pushing back the Red Army advance, but victory was fleeting. Their offensive momentum was suddenly shattered by overwhelming enemy firepower. The Soviet counterattack came with devastating force. Meanwhile, the Hitler Youth, some no older than 14, continued to hurl themselves at Soviet tanks with suicidal determination. Armed with Panzerfausts, they lay in wait at street corners, in the rubble of collapsed buildings, and in bombed-out tram stations, striking at Soviet armour at point-blank range. Many were killed instantly by shrapnel and machine gun fire before they could fire their weapons. Others succeeded in knocking out enemy tanks, only to be gunned down moments later. Their sacrifice was grimly noted by the battle-hardened foreign SS soldiers, who fought alongside them in the same hellish streets. Despite the carnage, Hauptsturmführer Henry Fenet would later claim that his men had managed to destroy an astonishing 62 Soviet tanks in the desperate street battles. The narrow, debris-filled roads of Berlin gave the defenders an advantage. Soviet armour, designed for rapid advances in open terrain, struggled to manoeuvre in the urban chaos. The Soviet forces suffered heavy losses and every street corner became a potential death trap. Yet the Red Army had one key advantage: its numbers were inexhaustible. There was no limit to their tank forces, recalled Erik Wallin, a Swedish volunteer in Nordland. The infantry we saw less and less. We realized the forces ranged against us were exclusively tanks, assault guns, and entire battalions of Stalin organ rockets. There wasn't an infantry soldier among them. The Soviet Katyusha rocket launchers, nicknamed Stalin's organs for the terrifying wailing sound they produced, were used indiscriminately, unleashing devastating barrages upon German-held streets. Entire city blocks vanished in firestorms as buildings collapsed under the relentless bombardment. The defenders, already battered by days of constant fighting, could do little to escape the carnage. But the Soviet infantry was not absent for long. When their tanks and artillery had done their work, shock troops moved in to clear out the remaining resistance, using one of the most feared weapons in their arsenal, flamethrowers. There was fighting everywhere, Fenet later recalled. In the backyards behind the houses, on the roofs with assault rifles, with hand grenades and with bayonets. The smoke and dust almost choked and blinded us. We could only see for half a metre. The fighting along Wilhelmstrasse, once one of Berlin's grandest avenues, turned into an apocalyptic scene. The street was littered with the blackened husks of destroyed Soviet tanks, their ammunition stores detonating in violent eruptions, sending flames and shrapnel into the air. Fuel tanks ignited, turning wrecked vehicles into blazing pyres, their twisted remains casting grotesque shadows against the inferno consuming the city. Berlin, once the proud capital of Hitler's Reich, had become a vision of hell. As the German capital burned around them, a small group of Charlemagne troops made their final stand in the basement of the former Gestapo headquarters. Trapped and vastly outnumbered, they barricaded themselves inside alongside approximately 100 military policemen, determined to hold out for as long as possible. Among them was Hauptsturmführer Henri Feney, his foot wounded but his resolve unbroken. He refused to leave his men, continuing to command them even as the walls of Berlin crumbled around them. It was here, in the dying days of the Reich, that Feney was personally presented with the Knight's Cross by General Major Wilhelm Mohnke. Once a high-ranking officer of the elite Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler division, Mohnke had been entrusted with the hopeless task of defending Hitler's government district. Despite the inevitable collapse of the city, he still carried out his final duty, recognizing acts of bravery among his men. For many of the Charlemagne soldiers, the Knight's Cross was the ultimate honor, the pinnacle of military distinction. But by this point, awards meant little. The war was lost. The only thing left to fight for was survival. Nevertheless, Feney, knowing the end was near, distributed the last few Knight's Crosses he had to those he deemed worthy. The following morning, the city fell eerily silent. The thunder of Soviet artillery had stopped. The fighting had ceased. The foreign SS troops, now mere shadows of their former strength, took shelter in a building inside the bombed-out Air Ministry. There, in the eerie quiet, they listened for any sign of what came next. Soon, the answer arrived. A few vehicles, draped in white flags, cautiously rolled through the devastated streets. Soviet soldiers emerged, accompanied by German officers. They approached the remaining defenders, urging them to lay down their arms. A Luftwaffe major personally sought out Feney, informing him that the surrender document had been signed. Berlin had officially capitulated. But for the French SS men, surrender was not an option. They knew what awaited them if they fell into Soviet hands, execution or worse. Rather than submit, they resolved to make one final attempt at escape. Under the cover of darkness, they abandoned their last position and descended into the subway tunnels beneath the city. Moving cautiously through the underground labyrinth, they followed the tracks, weaving their way through the ruins of Berlin's shattered transport network. The tunnels provided momentary safety, but even there, they were not alone. The echoes of Soviet boots and distant voices carried through the damp corridors. Eventually they emerged near Kaiserhof station, pausing to assess their next move. Above them, the streets were alive with the sounds of victory. Russian troops packed into military trucks honked their horns in celebration. The nightmare of the Third Reich was over. For Berlin's conquerors, it was a moment of triumph. For the surviving SS troops, it was a final reminder that they were now fugitives in a city that no longer belonged to them. Pressing forward, the SS men reached a bridge near the Potsdam train station, where they took shelter beneath the structure, concealed in the shadows. The plan was simple: wait until nightfall and attempt to escape the city under cover of darkness. Their goal was to reach the remnants of General of Panzer Troops Walter Wenck's formation. Wenck, commanding what was left of the 12th Army, had attempted to push toward Berlin to relieve the beleaguered defenders. But by now, even he had been forced to retreat. The idea of finding salvation in his ranks was little more than a desperate hope. Time was running out, and the Soviets were tightening their grip on the city. The fate of Feney's men now rested on whether they could slip through the enemy's lines, or if they too would be swallowed by the ruins of Hitler's fallen capital. While the battle for Berlin raged, General of Panzer Troops Walter Wenck had given his men a singular purpose: not to reclaim the city, but to hold open a fragile escape route for those still trapped within. His 12th Army, battered and outnumbered, fought not for Hitler nor for victory, but to buy time for retreating soldiers, desperate civilians, and anyone else who could still make it out before the Red Army sealed the city shut. Wenck's forces engaged in fierce rearguard actions, keeping the last corridors westward open as long as possible. For Hauptsturmführer Henri Feney and his remaining French SS troops, this slim hope of escape had been their final goal. Hiding beneath a bridge near the Potsdam train station, they waited for the cover of night, hoping to slip past the Soviet encirclement and link up with Wenck's retreating army. If they could reach the Western Allies, they might at least avoid the horrors of Soviet captivity. But the Soviets were already tightening the noose. Before they could leave their hiding place, Russian troops discovered them. There was no fight left to give. Fernet and his men, exhausted, wounded, and out of ammunition, were taken prisoner. They became part of the 130,000 German troops captured by the Red Army in and around Berlin, soldiers who would soon face the grim reality of Soviet captivity. While most of the foreign Waffen SS troops who fought in Berlin were either killed or captured, a handful managed to escape the ruins of the city, though few would remain free for long. One Norwegian SS soldier successfully evaded capture and fled the Soviet-controlled sector, but his freedom was short-lived. Captured later by a drunken Russian guard, he saw an opportunity, overpowered his captor, and made a daring escape. Fleeing westward, he eventually reached the British lines, where he surrendered, preferring Allied captivity to the brutal fate that awaited him in Soviet hands. Another SS fighter, determined to disappear, took refuge in the ruins of a cellar, waiting for the chaos to subside. Moving under the cover of darkness, he eventually made his way north, reaching the coast. There he boarded a boat to Denmark, clinging to the hope that he might slip through unnoticed. But his reprieve was short-lived. Upon arrival, he was quickly arrested. For most of the Charlemagne and Nordland troops who had fought to the bitter end in Berlin, escape was an illusion. The war was over. Their fight had ended not in victory, nor in retreat, but in the cold grasp of Soviet captivity, a fate many would not survive. Not all of the SS Nordland soldiers fell into Soviet hands. Against all odds, Erik Wallin and Hans-Gustav Persson, both veterans of the division, managed to successfully escape the ruins of Berlin. Disguising themselves as Italian refugees, they navigated their way through the chaotic city, slipping past 2 Soviet checkpoints. Their survival hinged on deception, passing as displaced civilians rather than Waffen SS soldiers, whose capture meant near-certain execution or a slow death in Soviet captivity. Their daring escape eventually led them to the Elbe River, where they boarded a ferry bound for British-controlled territory. When they reached the Western Allies, they were finally safe from Soviet retribution. But for most who reached the Allied lines, safety was a temporary illusion. For the thousands of German soldiers who successfully crossed into British and American zones, a new ordeal awaited them. The Western Allies, eager to distance themselves from the remnants of the Nazi war machine, swiftly repatriated most German prisoners to their home countries. Upon arrival, many of these former soldiers were arrested and placed on trial, facing justice for their role in the war. In the aftermath of the Battle of Berlin, French General Philippe Leclerc encountered a defiant group of 12 captured Frenchmen from the Waffen SS Charlemagne division, volunteers who had fought to the bitter end for the collapsing Reich. As they stood before him in their tattered German uniforms, Leclerc reportedly confronted them with disdain, asking, "Are you not ashamed of wearing German uniforms?" One of the SS men, unfazed and unrepentant, replied coldly, "And you? Are you not ashamed for wearing an American one?" According to some contemporaries, that brief exchange sealed their fate. Enraged, Leclerc turned to his men and gave the curt order, "Get rid of them." No trial followed, no military tribunal convened. The men of the RMT, Régiment de Marche du Tchad, understood the order clearly. It was a death sentence. The captured French SS soldiers were summarily executed on the spot, without ceremony or justice. Their bodies lay where they fell for 3 days, untouched and unburied, until an American burial detail eventually arrived to collect their remains. Among those captured by the Soviets was Hauptsturmführer Henri Fernet, the French SS officer who had led the last stand of Sturmbataillon Charlemagne. Instead of executing him outright, the Soviets extradited Fernet to France, where he was sentenced to 20 years of hard labour. However, in a surprising turn of events, he was released after serving only half of his sentence, a fate far more merciful than what awaited many of his comrades. But while some foreign Waffen SS troops faced trials and imprisonment, others suffered far worse fates. The Russians and Cossacks who had served in various SS formations, often as anti-Bolshevik volunteers, were handed back to the Soviet Union. Stalin, who viewed them as traitors, ordered the execution of thousands. The remainder were packed into cattle cars and deported to the Gulag archipelago in Siberia, where most perished in the frozen wastelands. Among the Slavic Waffen SS troops, one group fared significantly better, the Ukrainians of the Galician division. Unlike the Russian SS volunteers, they had a powerful set of advocates working on their behalf. The Red Cross, the Vatican, and the Polish army all intervened, arguing that the Galician division had fought primarily against the Red Army and had not committed war crimes on the scale of other SS formations. Because of this diplomatic pressure, the Ukrainian soldiers were not sent back to the Soviet Union. Instead, after a brief internment, they were permitted to emigrate, settling in the United Kingdom and North America, where many would rebuild their lives far from the ruins of the Third Reich. In Yugoslavia, the fate of former SS men was more unpredictable. Many of those captured were brutally treated, facing execution or death in labour camps. However, President Josip Broz Tito, aware of the delicate balance between the ethnic factions within Yugoslavia, chose a more pragmatic approach. He recognized that indiscriminately punishing all former SS members could destabilize his fragile new government. Instead, only those accused of specific war crimes against Yugoslavians were put on trial, while amnesty was granted to the rest, even to those who had once fought under the banner of the Waffen SS. The war had ended, but for those who had fought on the losing side, especially those who had worn the double runes of the Waffen SS, the struggle for survival had only just begun. Whether through execution, imprisonment, exile, or deception, each man's fate was now determined not by war, but by the shifting politics of the post-war world. The effectiveness of the foreign Waffen SS divisions varied widely. While some units evolved into formidable fighting forces, others never achieved battlefield proficiency and were relegated to anti-partisan warfare, often in brutal suppression campaigns against local resistance movements. Many of these formations lacked the cohesion, discipline and training of their German counterparts, suffering from high desertion rates, internal strife and inconsistent leadership. However, there were exceptions. Units like the 5th SS Panzer Division Wiking and the 11th SS Nordland Division developed reputations for fierce combat effectiveness, particularly on the Eastern Front, where they often found themselves in desperate defensive actions against overwhelming Soviet forces. Yet regardless of their battlefield record, nearly all Waffen SS divisions were tainted by war crimes. The very nature of their existence tied them irrevocably to the atrocities of the Nazi regime. Throughout occupied Europe, Waffen SS formations were directly or indirectly involved in massacres of civilians, execution of prisoners of war, and systematic acts of terror. Foreign-born Waffen SS fighters were no exception. Despite its dark legacy, there is no denying the role that foreign Waffen SS units played in the expansion of the organization. Without foreign volunteers, the Waffen SS would have remained a relatively small elite corps. Instead, by recruiting foreign troops on an unprecedented scale, the Waffen SS doubled in size every 12 months from late 1942 onward. What had begun as Hitler's personal paramilitary force transformed into a multinational army that drew manpower from France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Scandinavia, the Balkans, Ukraine, and beyond. By the final years of the war, foreign troops made up a significant portion of the Waffen SS, with some divisions consisting almost entirely of non-German volunteers. Ultimately, the Waffen SS, once envisioned as an elite fighting force, became increasingly dependent on these foreign recruits to maintain its strength. In the war's last days, it was men from these very units who fought to the bitter end in Berlin, resisting Soviet forces until there was nothing left to fight for. The Reich had fallen, their cause was lost, and for those who survived, the post-war world had no place for them. The foreign Waffen SS had helped sustain the regime's military machine, but when the war ended, the price of their service would be heavy: arrest, exile, execution, or a lifetime bearing the stigma of their allegiance to the most infamous military organization of the 20th century. And with that, we wrap up today's video. I'm incredibly grateful to have you here until the end. Your support truly means the world to me. A huge shout out to my amazing patrons. If you'd like to support the channel or get access to some exclusive content, the links to my Patreon and Instagram are down below. I hope you learned something new, and as always, I'll see you in the next adventure. Take care and goodbye for now.